Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining this webinar. Welcome to the fourth installment of the SPARK Program's webinar series. My name is Malvika, and I work as a consultant at Carbon Limits, and I will be your moderator for today. In today's webinar, we will be focusing on the guide Promoting Ambition and Transformational Change using Article 6. This guide aims to provide host parties, acquiring parties, buyers, and activity participants with clear actions that promote transformational change and raise climate ambition using Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. We will also learn more about this from our panelists who will be speaking after our guide authors present the guide in today's webinar. This morning, we heard from Carl Magnus from Swedish Energy Agency, and right now in the afternoon session, we will hear from Felipe de Leon from the supervisory body of the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. We are looking forward to the discussions and Q&A with our speakers today. So without further ado, let's start with a few housekeeping notes before we begin the proceedings of today. This session is being recorded and broadcast live on YouTube. Please visit the GGGI media page on YouTube to access this webinar. The Article 6 Toolbox guides are available on the SPARK website. Please use the QR code that you see displayed on the slide right now to access these guides. You can also use the Q&A function on Zoom. If you toggle to the bottom of the screen, you can see a Q&A right next to the chat function. Please use this to raise any questions you might have for our speakers. We do have dedicated Q&A sessions for discussing the questions that are raised using this function. You can raise these questions at any point, but we will take it during the dedicated Q&A sessions at the end of each presentation. To help us improve on future webinars, we request you to take a very short survey that will be presented at the end of this webinar series. And lastly, in this webinar, we have the option for translation to Spanish. You can click on the language button, which appears as a small globe, and change to the channel of your choice. Also, a note to our audience who want to listen in English, please be on the English channel and not just the original interpretation. Just in case we take some questions in Spanish, then it will be translated to English for you. With that, I would like to present the IKI SPARK program structure. Supporting Preparedness for Article 6 Cooperation, or SPARK in short, is a 5-year multi-country project launched in 2022. Implementing is led by Global Green Growth Institute and supported by a consortium of partners that consists of UNEP-CCC, GFA Consulting Group, KPC, and Carbon Limits. The project aims to support countries to increase climate ambition by enhancing the readiness of Colombia, Pakistan, Thailand, and Zambia to participate in the international carbon market under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. To achieve this, the project aims to support the governments with policy and regulatory frameworks needed to participate in the market, along with increasing private sector engagement. Next slide, please. Thank you. The agenda for today's webinar begins with opening remarks from Malin Ahlberg from BMWK and John Christensen from UNEP-CCC, followed by the presentation on the guide content by Karen Olsen and Randall Spalding-Felcher. We will have a short Q&A after this. As mentioned earlier, please use the Q&A function to raise any questions that you might have on the content. After the Q&A, we will hear from Felipe de Leon from the supervisory body of the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism before ending the webinar with a feedback survey and Q&A with our guest speaker. With that, I'm pleased to welcome Malin Ahlberg to provide the welcoming remarks for today.
So, hello everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. So welcome to the 5th webinar of the Article 6 Toolbox webinar series. So today we will focus on the topic that belongs to the core objective of Article 6 cooperation. It is the question how to promote ambition and transformational change with cooperative approaches. In comparison to the other SPARC Toolbox guides, the unique point with this guide is that the guide applies to implementing countries, so-called host countries, and to acquiring countries and or other buyers. So as the different market stakeholders have options and responsibilities to accelerate ambition and transformational change. So carbon finance offers host party countries a way to mobilize finance for their most difficult to implement mitigation action now and set themselves up for longer term greener growth and sustainable development. Therefore, countries should develop a strategy how they want to use Article 6 to strive for these goals. Article 6 activities enhance also monitoring and reporting skills in host countries and generates high quality data. This is a crucial prerequisite for later then to be able to introduce a national carbon pricing scheme. So this can then in turn drive even further the transformational change in countries. The acquiring side has also a responsibility to strive for higher ambition. The use of ITMOs should not delay or replace any action to reduce or avoid emission in their own distinct jurisdiction. So they have the option to cancel parts of the purchase credits towards voluntary commitments. Furthermore, acquiring party can use ITMOs to meet its long-term target earlier. So with the Guide 1 presented today, you will learn how Article 6 carbon market activities can help closing the ambition gap to reach the Paris goals of net zero emission and sustainable development by 2050. I recommend also to look out the checklist in the guidebook at the end of the guidebook, which gives a summary of options and actions that the key stakeholder groups can implement to raise ambition and promote transformational change. So thank you very much to Carbon Limits and UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center for bringing your extensive expertise into this guide. And I'm looking forward to the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you, Malin. I would now like to invite John Christensen from UNEP CCC to provide his opening remarks.
Yes, thank you very much. As I said, I'm the director of the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center and would like to welcome you to the webinar also. I mean, Malin already said a lot of good and important things. I'll try and be relatively brief, and I don't really work in the details on Article 6, but more follow it from, you could say, from the political level, and has since it was negotiated in Paris been very focused around how you could stimulate the combination of enhanced ambition, effective markets, and sustainable development. So I think this guide for me is maybe the most exciting one in the project. And but that's more because I don't deal with the details of it. But I think overall, I mean, for us, SPARC is a very exciting project. It has a kind of unique collaboration that you already presented on the first slides, where you have a number of countries, you have international organizations, but you also have private companies in the same group working together, which for us is a very unique setup and I think very successful so far. So that's really positive. The center here is working on a number of different climate issues, or most of them, I would say, from mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and so on. And we are engaged in well over 70 countries right now, mainly technical assistance, but almost in all cases with an engagement that goes hand in hand with guidance development and application. So the SPAR6 guide is a typical example of what we're engaged in a number of different areas. And as I said, it deals with with basically getting it right, because I think it's really, really important for the first Article 6 projects and activities and capacity building institutions and planning, really to try and demonstrate how to do this in accordance with the principles and ideas in the Paris Agreement. I think success will also be an important input to the ongoing work on the new indices, called them 3.0 or whatever, that countries are supposed to submit sometime next year, ideally in February, but more likely sometimes towards the COP time, towards the end of the year. And many countries, I think, around 150 or so, will probably include market mechanisms, not with a very specific idea about how to do it and how to make it right. But I think the project here can really help both stimulate this process, but also give them a realistic idea about what's possible and what's not possible and so on. So I look forward to hearing some of the details. I can see we had a similar session in the morning for people coming in other time zones. We had about 80 people. We have another 80 on here. So I'm really impressed about the interest in the topic, but it reflects what I just said about the country interest also. And I think Marlene introduced the guide already, so I don't want to go in a lot of detail with that. I think one of the things I'm doing right now is finishing this year's emission gap report together with my colleague who's leading it. And what I can say without revealing a whole lot is that the emission gap has not gone down, and we're getting closer and closer to 2030, so the challenge gets bigger and bigger. We also start looking in this year's report to 2035, because that's the target year for the new indices. And all we can say is that that's a real need for enhanced short-term implementation of what countries have already said, but also then combining that with a dramatic increase in the longer-term ambition, which is challenging in the current geopolitical situation. And I think the last thing I'll say is that I think important for the ones involved in the project and the countries is also that there is, at least in some parts of the climate community, quite a lot of skepticism about market mechanisms. And I think one of the things you can really do to benefit the community is to show also with the guide here how this can be done, how it can stimulate engagement, how it can stimulate implementation and ambition at the same time. And if you can really be successful with the countries in doing that, I think you are doing a really, really big service to the carbon market in the future. So I wish you a good webinar, and I'll be really interested to looking in and listening in. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Marlon, for the welcoming remarks. Like both of them mentioned, we have a lot of interesting sessions for today. So just a reminder to please use the Q&A function to raise any questions that you might have for our speakers today. So I'm going to dive in a bit deeper into understanding the SPARC toolbox. The Article 6 toolbox draws on the consortium's diverse experience in Article 6 activity development to create guidance and tools that can be used in the target countries. So the toolbox development will promote consistency across the different countries and efficiency in the delivery as well. A core principle will be the adaptability of the toolbox to different scenarios that will help it fit the national conditions over the course of the program. The first set of outputs in the Article 6 toolbox are 6 guides that target the fundamental needs of the host party governments on the one hand and activity participants on the other hand. Out of the 6 guides, 3 cater to the host party governments, 2 are tailored for activity participants. This can be both public or private activity participants. And the one on ambition and transformational change encompasses aspects of both areas. Next slide. But when we refer to the Article 6 toolbox as such, we don't just refer to these 6 guides. It extends beyond that. Development of training materials, potential tools, and additional resources that can support capacity building are also planned as part of this toolbox. These could include MAC analysis, developing quantification tools, and any additional resources depending on the needs that have been identified in our target countries. So at the country level, the project will engage a broad range of stakeholders, including national and subnational government, the private sector, academia, and the youth to build the enabling environment required for carbon trading under Article 6. So that was a brief introduction to the SPARK program and the Article 6 toolbox. So without any further delay, I would like to invite Karen Olson from UNEP CCC to know more about this guide on promoting ambition and transformational change. Her presentation will be continued by Randall from Carbon Limits. So I'll pass it on to you now, Karen.
Thank you, Malavika, and good to meet all of you online, though I cannot see you. But I can see that there are 91 of you, so that's great to see. I will give an introduction to Guide 1, the content that you see on this slide, and also background on why and how Article 6 matters for promoting ambition and transformational change. So here you see the guide has 4 chapters. The first is the introduction, giving this background, why Article 6 matters for ambition raising and transformational change. And then for 3 stakeholder groups that have been introduced, we have a chapter for each, which explains options and also actions for the different stakeholders, how to walk the talk, how to make it concrete. So it's not a long guide, it's not a how-to guide, but it's sort of identifying the options and the actions. And then in the other guides that are longer, you will have more in-depth description of how to do it. And we can also, as Malavika explained, we can on particular issues, and some of them are very technical, on baseline setting. It's a mix of, yeah, you will see. I'm going to go into the substance for in the next slide. Yeah, so that's the introduction chapter that I will go into first. So this slide shows the background, answering the question, why does Article 6 matter for ambition raising and transformational change? And the quote here is taken from the preamble of Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, and states what are the overall objectives. It's the mandate that applies to all the cooperative approaches, 6.4, 6.2, and 6.8. So 6.8 is the non-market approaches, so we only talk about the market approaches. But as you can see in the slide, it reads that cooperative approaches overall focus on the voluntary use of Article 6 for NDC implementation, to allow exactly for higher ambition, promoting sustainable development and environmental integrity. Next. Article 6 is a powerful policy tool for transformational impact. In the figure above, it really simply shows what we mean by transformational impact. It's greenhouse gas mitigation outcomes, sustainable development outcomes at scale and sustained over time. So it's not climate first only, even this is what is priced. It's also in context of sustainable development. So it's climate and development together. And increasingly we see in the market that when SDG outcomes are assessed, positive and negatives, quantified if possible, but also qualitative assessment is fine. But when such impacts can be demonstrated, you get a premium. So it's also a driver and a leverage for a lot of mitigation actions that are could otherwise be hard to achieve, where development SDG outcomes could be a key driver. So the powerful policy tool comes from aligning carbon market activities with the Paris Agreement goals, NDC targets, and long-term low emission strategies that are consistent with a 1.5-degree pathway. And this is what requires rapid and deep systemic changes in all sectors of society and all levels. Transformational impact. So showing the significance, this is the studies here are in the emissions gap report from 2020. They show that the quantitative mitigation potential estimate is that in an ideal situation with full use of carbon markets, and this is based on modeling, but 4 to 5 gigatons of CO2 emission equivalents of mitigation outcomes could be traded per year by 2030, enabling cost savings in the range of 40 to 60% to achieve NDC targets. Very significant potential. And in the next slide, here I have taken the definition of transformational change coming from ICAT, Initiative for Climate Action Transparency from 2020, where we have a full methodology on how to assess transformational impact. But for the purpose of rationalizing what this means for Article 6, we over-rationalize it, starting from this sort of saying that it is a change of a system away from high carbon practices. It contributes to a zero carbon society, and it's in line with the global goals. And you'll see in the next slide how we unpack it. This is still high level, but we unpack it as layers of transformational impact assessment, outcomes for greenhouse gas emissions and sustainable development goals at scale and sustained, and then here the processes of change. And these could also be both the drivers, but also barriers. And we've categorized them into technology, agents, incentives, and norms. Incentives being both economic and regulatory. Technology, you'll hear more about that, emerging, but also those that exist and are not yet available in all countries, but can be promoted through markets. The agents who are the change makers, but also norms in relation to such as gender equality can also be a driver of transformational change. So we're not going into the details, but just to let you know, in the methodology, we have also characteristics. It's below of transformational change, and we have indicators that allow assessment both in qualitative and quantitative terms. But we're not going to that level of detail in this guide. And just really brief, when we assess impact, it's assessed on both dimensions, outcomes and processes. Next. So back to the emissions gap and how Article 6 can help close what we call the action and ambition gaps. So the UNEP gap report in 2022 estimates that the ambition gap between what countries have pledged and what science indicates is necessary for a 1.5-degree pathway is 23 gigatons for unconditional targets and 24 conditional targets. On the figure, you see that you see then that this is for the purple, and the yellow lines are the unconditional and conditional targets. And the green area in the figure shows the potential for Article 6 to close both the gaps. The action gap is between current national policies, the red line on the top, and the achievement of NDC targets. And referring back to the potential of carbon markets, we have this very significant cost reduction potential, 40 to 60% for implementing NDCs. So next. This is an overview of the stakeholder options to promote ambition raising and transformational change. We have the 3 key stakeholders: the host parties, acquiring parties, other buyers such as non-state, private sector, and the activity developers. And the bullet points are the options, so I'll not go into them here, but we'll do that in the next chapter, and the next slide, which is the options for host parties. And I will start with these options in the next slide. We have 4 options for the host parties. Alignment of Article 6 activities with long-term low-emission development strategies, supporting NDC ambition cycles, identifying priority technologies for investments, about governance frameworks, both at national and subnational levels, that promote sustainable development, including safeguards for no harm done, transformational change, and ambition raising. And last, the transparency and MRV frameworks described under the reporting review requirements under Article 6.2 and also integrated into the enhanced transparency framework for reporting and review of the use of ITMOs for NDC implementation. And you'll hear more in the first option, explaining how development of long-term low-emission development strategies supporting NDC ambition cycles can be promoted by use of Article 6. So the main thing here is how NDC targets can inform crediting baselines aligned with the pathway to 1.5 degrees. The figure shows that this starts with an analysis of how NDC targets, particularly the unconditional target, the yellow line, informs the crediting baseline in the other figure, the green one. And that the Article 6 activity, the red line, that emissions are below the crediting baseline, which will generate emission reductions that are Paris aligned. And to the right, you see the actions for host parties to use the long-term low-emission development strategies and NDC scenarios, informing baseline development. So that is where it gets a little technical. Yeah. The next is an option to facilitate investments in priority technologies. And this can be done by host parties through the creation of positive and negative lists. The figure shows that technologies can be prioritized according to the costs of mitigating a ton of CO2, the vertical axis, and the barriers for implementation, the horizontal axis. So positive lists for Article 6, prioritizing Article 6 technologies for investment in these technologies are those that have high cost and high barriers, which are typically emerging technologies with a low market penetration, and the examples here are electric vehicles and carbon capture and storage, also for bioenergy removals. The negative list is the red area, are technologies that are better suited for achievement of unconditional NDC targets because they're low cost and mature technologies, such as wind power and N2O destruction. And the yellow area for climate finance is in the middle. And the examples here are REDD+ and landfill gas. But so the difference from Paris to Kyoto Protocol is that it's a change of game in the sense that now host parties, all countries have NDC targets. They did not in the Kyoto Protocol. So instead of selling the cheap credits, countries needed for their own commitments to achieve these the NDC targets as cheap as possible. And therefore, it's from a host party perspective, it's good to identify what is expensive and then ask the market to promote, or sort of the market can help promote these emerging technologies that are more expensive mitigation options. So the price of transformational high integrity credits is going to be higher than we have seen before. Next. And two more options for host parties are to develop and implement governance frameworks and to strengthen national transparency and accountability frameworks for using Article 6. The action points here are to define sustainable development priorities nationally, incorporate criteria for monitoring into Article 6 authorization criteria and processes. Soon there will be, hopefully in just before COP29 in Baku, the next supervisory body meeting. Philippe, you know a lot more about it. That there will the sustainable development tool for Article 6 is up for decision, which it's mandatory for 6.4 and it could also be used for 6.2. So right now it's not available yet, but it contains safeguards and it contains an approach to assess sustainable development impacts. And it's already available in an advanced draft format and could also be applicable under Article 6.2. So an action point is also to adopt or incorporate concrete transformational change indicators, as we've seen for the technology positive list, as part of authorization criteria, to adopt safeguards, social and environmental frameworks, to avoid or mitigate unintended negative impacts, particularly to indigenous people and local communities. It's an action point to enhance monitoring and reporting through digital means, which can bring down the costs and improve data quality. And then it's an action point to enhance tracking, reporting, and reviewing in the biannual transparency reports under the transparency framework, to convey how Article 6 mitigation actions promote transformational change and NDC ambition raising. That is it for host parties.
Okay, thanks so much, Karen. Yeah, I'm Randall Spalding Fetcher, so I'll take over now. Excuse me, and talk about options for acquiring parties and then also options for activity developers. And I think, as Karen said, just so you know, we are going through a lot of these options quite quickly. There's plenty more detail, not only in this guide, but in the other guides that you'll find on the SPARC website. So yeah, and also remember that, as Malin, I think, mentioned, there's actually a checklist that kind of outlines these at the end of this particular guide as well. So let's go into acquiring parties, because we're not going to let them off the hook, right? Everybody has some responsibility in terms of increasing ambition and transformational change. So let's go to the next slide. So there are three main issues that we talk about in the guide with acquiring parties or other buyers. So one is really just canceling ITMOs, and I'm going to show you an example of that. So this concept of overall mitigation of global emissions. The other thing that I'll say a little bit more about in a later slide is how to use ITMOs and also use the savings to increase ambition. What I won't spend too much time today on is the role of non-state actors, but there's some very good information in the guide how also non-state actors can use ITMOs either under a kind of traditional offsetting paradigm or this new mitigation contribution paradigm. But that's a big topic, so we're not going to get into that today. Let me just rather go to the next slide, I think, because we talk about the rules under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanisms are you've got to cancel 2% of your units of the ITMOs for overall mitigation of global emissions. But that 2%, first of all, it's strongly encouraged outside of that mechanism under the 6.2 framework, not required, but it doesn't have to be 2%, right? It could be 5, 10, 30%, right? So there's a huge amount of leverage for acquiring parties, both state and non-state actors, to simply cancel emission reduction, because that means they're not used by anyone and therefore they contribute to global emission rates. So that's a very simple one. Next slide. The other thing to remember is, the whole idea of carbon trading, like both John referred to and then Karin, is that there's supposed to be savings, right? We're doing this because, you can reduce emissions less expensively, potentially in another country. So what are you going to do with those savings, right? And so what we put is, the step one is, well, why not use that savings to actually overachieve nationally, current NDCs, right? That's an action in the very short term. And then there's some other ways as well that you might think about, well, maybe you're rather using those ITMOs towards longer term goals to achieve those faster. And there are a number of countries, even countries within the EU, that are doing that. And then even within domestic carbon pricing mechanisms, can you allow import of ITMOs to lower the compliance costs for entities under a carbon pricing instrument, and then increase the ambition of that instrument, right? Because it's not just about cost savings, it's about translating that into increased goals. And then even with there are a lot of government procurement programs now looking for ITMO purchases. And I think what you're seeing is more requirements to demonstrate both contributions to sustainable development, but also to transformational change. So that's important, because it's not just about the immediate impacts of these collaborative activities or cooperative approaches. It's what do they catalyze over the long term, that sustained change that Karin talked about. All right, next slide. So let's talk a little bit about activity participants, and we'll just go one slide ahead. The way the guide is organized here is, along the activity cycle, there are a number of different places where the activity participant, and we use this term, I know it's kind of clumsy, but it's what's in the 6.4 rule. So this is where we talk about activity participant and not project developer. So the activity participant has to kind of screen ideas to decide whether to move forward. They might write some type of information note. We talk about one of our favorite new acronyms here, the MAIN, the Mitigation Activity Idea Note. They then have to fully design a project, producing a MAD, which I think is probably one of the funnier acronyms that we use in this field. And then finally, implementation and monitoring. So for each of the options that we outline in this chapter in the guide, we talk about what that might mean at each stage of development. So let's go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about below business as usual baselines, maybe implementing that along the whole activity development change, and then promoting both sustainable development and transformational impact also along that activity cycle. So let's hit the next slide. So this is actually a graphic that just represents something that Karin already referred to, is this idea of, in traditional carbon markets, it was good enough to have a conservative baseline. As long as you conservatively represented what would have happened without the impact of the carbon market activity, you were okay. That's not what the rules say now for Article 6. It says below business as usual. So what does that look like? You have to have some way to get from the red line here, which was a conservative BAU line, to something below that. Now, there's still potential emission reductions here and potential tradable units that you see in the shading, right? Because the activity scenario is quite a bit lower. But what you see in the yellow line is an increasingly stringent baseline. And as an aside, of course, in the short term, what this does is it just changes the allocation of the emission reductions. It keeps more of them in the host country. But in the long run, what it does is that it means only the most kind of advanced technologies, the lowest carbon technologies, are going to actually benefit from this type of trading. So you're driving investment towards those instead of minor or incremental improvements from the current situation. Now you might say, well, how are we going to get these values? And there's a lot of technical literature on this that's kind of referenced in the guide. But I mean, simply you could look at many NDCs have certain goals for percentage of reduction of emissions from BAU, right? By 2030, for example. So that's one starting point, but there could be other factors that you use. And you probably will need to update this periodically, right? So as NDC cycles are renewed, and both of our earlier speakers mentioned that that's happening pretty soon, there'll be a need to further tighten up some of these goals and to apply that to the way we think about baselines. All right? So that's the baseline contraction factor. Now let's go to these two other ideas. So, so let me say a little bit more about baseline contraction factor. So, in the screening phase, of course, you won't have all the nitty-gritty detail, right? You'll basically, in the screening phase, you might simply want to acknowledge that we're not going to use a BAU baseline, and therefore that could have some impact on the resulting emission reductions that can be issued and marketed. Whereas then when you get to the information note stage, right, by that point, you need to have some methodology for doing this. And in the MAD stage, you need the actual parameters, right? There you're going to articulate exactly how are we going to translate GDP growth, NDC goals, et cetera, into this, and then we'll implement that on an ongoing basis. So this, again, is an example of how, this implementation gets more detailed over the course of the activity cycle. So let's go to the next slide. What would that look like for something like promoting sustainable development? The earliest stages, I think, and when we talk about screening here, we're really talking about kind of a desk-based assessment of whether you want to spend, what could be hundreds of thousands of dollars to develop an Article 6 project idea, right? So at that stage, you may simply look around and say, well, what are the broad positive impacts of this activity? Are there some emerging tools that can be used? Again, in the information note stage, maybe you hone in on a few indicators that are tied to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But by the time you get to the MAD, you have to have the specific choice of tools and indicators in place. And as Karin mentioned, of course, because the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism requires this and will have a tool available, that is one option. There are also a number of other options out there that are available. And then, again, what's very different about the past is that many projects in the CDM era might identify some of these impacts, but they didn't do ongoing monitoring. So here, those tools need to also provide for ongoing monitoring and measurement during implementation. Let's go to the next slide. Similarly with transformational change. So even at the screening stage, you could think about some of the mapping of ideas and agents, outcomes and processes that Karin presented, try to begin to understand how might this activity, what kind of effects does it have outside of its boundaries, for example. And then when you get to the main stage, now you want to start looking, are there methodologies or approaches already out there, say from the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, ICAT? Can we find specific things we can apply to this activity, which then you need to codify in the MAD. That needs to be very clear, not just what the actions or tools are, but how they're going to be applied, and then you monitor that on an ongoing basis. So, this is a big ask, and we recognize this, and yet I think more and more it's becoming clear this is what's needed for Article 6, this new generation of international carbon markets to truly deliver on this potential for promoting ambition and transformational change. So I think that's the last slide. Yes. So I'm going to pause there, and I think we'll go to some early questions, but thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Randall, and thank you, Karin, for your presentations. I would just like to remind all of the participants that please feel free to ask any questions that you might have in the Q&A function. We currently don't have any open questions, so feel free to ask any questions that you might have for Karin and Randall. While we are waiting for these questions, Randall, Karin, maybe we can expand a bit on some of the topics that you briefly touched upon while we wait for the questions to come in.
Sure. One thing, if I can just jump in, one thing I would like to just emphasize, I know I mentioned this, is that we intentionally did not make this a 300-page manual for transformational change. It was tempting because the knowledge is out there. But so when you look at this guide, what you'll see, and Karin pointed to this, is that the sections and the description of the actions are relatively short, but they refer to other resources. So there is a ton of work done by ICAT and also other UNEP CCC projects. There's a lot of work out there on sustainable development indicators, et cetera. So the idea is that this gives you a kind of starting point. And again, I think this checklist at the end is helpful because you can literally go through and say, okay, I'm an activity developer. I'm really shooting for the highest quality activity. There's a checklist of 8 or 10 things, and I can ask, have I done all these? And if not, well, the guide will give me some indication of where I might find out how to go about that. So that's just one thing I would emphasize.
Thank you, Randall. Karen, similarly, is there something that you would also like to highlight?
Yes, there are no questions. So I wonder if everything is crystal clear. But we had in the morning, we did have some questions. Oops, I see
we have the poll
Yeah,
question.
we do
So
have a
that's
poll question coming in now to find out exactly what was it that was new for all of the participants who have joined us.
That's great. Thanks.
go for the poll then. Yeah.
So I have a question, but as a panelist, I don't have access to the Q&A thing. Is that, can I ask anyway?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Felipe.
Thanks. So one of the things, I'm sort of jumping the gun, but this is an interesting topic. Thank you, Randall and Karen, for the presentation. It's a fascinating document. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that you included not only host party, but also buying parties, right? Because you, I think, pointed out quite interestingly that there's a shared responsibility there. Another component that I think was particularly interesting is, I'm not sure you said this specifically, but I think it's sort of at least implied in the work. NDCs and sort of LTSs and these policies that serve as the reference for these sorts of efforts are going to have an opportunity, at least, to get a lot more specific and a lot more nuanced as a way to enable faster and more aligned Article 6 action by other stakeholders in the ecosystem. Would you say that's a fair sort of takeaway from your presentation and from the approach that you're putting forward in SPARC?
You want to start, Karen?
Yeah, I think so. It's with the purpose of aligning Article 6 activities with, I mean, not just projects, standalone projects that we've pretty much had it in the Kyoto Protocol, but that they have to be through this using unconditional NDC targets for informing crediting baselines. I think that this is a very technical way of making the new generation of carbon markets work for ambition raising. And yes, we've sort of touched upon all these three key stakeholders, groups of stakeholders, because it's a shared responsibility across all the market participants to get the markets Paris aligned for ambition raising and integrity and so on. So I don't know, Philippe, if that really hit the nail for your question, but it's some overall reflections.
Yeah, I can add a couple of things. One is that I think this kind of refers to what you said, Philippe. I mean, having more elaborated NDC implementation plans, and obviously ones that are linked to longer term strategies, makes a huge difference, right? Because it's one thing to kind of set very broad goals. It's another thing to put in place the kind of policies, instruments, et cetera, that will guide the private sector to where they can contribute the most. And I still think there's a mindset shift that people are struggling with, and Karin alluded to it, right? Because I know we work with a lot of different countries, and the governments are being approached by people who have very, very traditional activities, very low-cost activities that they want to have authorized under Article 6, right? With really no implementation of sustainable development tools, none of this. So yeah, I think it will take a little bit of time, and part of the reason why Spark has done this work and also is working to demonstrate this in pilot projects is to show, not only must this be done, right, because there's the imperative, right, that we work on a larger scale, but that it can be done. So yeah, when we hear people asking the government to approve something that is a kind of standalone project that costs a few dollars a ton mitigation, we think, well, is that really, again, it's not that some of these activities, it's not that we're saying certain activities we're no longer going to support for mitigation. It's what's the right tool for the job. Article 6 is the right tool for different jobs than CDM was the tool for. CDM was able to get us started, launch us into this field, build up a lot of expertise. Article 6 is now a tool, as I think we've argued today, for real transformational impact, right? Working with much greater ambition, both in design of activities and in the use of the resulting outcomes.
Thank you, Randall, and thank you, Karen, for answering that question, and for Felipe for jumping in to ask this question. We have results of the poll now, so it does seem like a lot of people learned a lot of new things from this webinar. More than half of the people who have participated have said they've learned about the practical options to raise the ambition and to promote transformational change in their activity. And we still have votes for the layers of transformational impact assessment and the definition of transformational change. So I think it was a good presentation overall. And I think our participants were just a bit shy. We have questions now in the Q&A. So if you're up for it, I'll start with the first one. With public funding currently quite constrained, are these actions to catalyze transformational change on the buyer side a reality? And are governments actively in the negotiation of Article 6 transitions while keeping this in mind? Who would like to take this? Randall, Karen?
Can I just ask, right, it's a logistics question. What I see is it's marked as Marshall Brown would like to answer this question, but I assume it just means it's to mark it for us to answer it. Is that right?
That's
okay.
Right.
The one thing I'll say, just to jump in, is that yes, and what we did not cover today is there's a section about non-state actors. I think this idea of contribution claims is incredibly important, and we're really doing all we can to build some momentum, because you're right. Public funding is not going to do all this, and yet there's some challenges with the voluntary market trying to use to necessarily do some of those activities as fully authorized and correspondingly adjusted activities. So the idea of mitigation contributions, where the private sector can actually help close the implementation gap, or not just the ambition gap, but like Karen said, also that immediate implementation gap, is very powerful and very important.
Thank you, Randall. And in your answer, you've actually covered the follow-up question on that. Like, with this constrained public funding in mind, what would be the role of private sector in driving this ambition and transformational change? But is there anything else you would like to add to that second half of the question? On the role of the private sector, yeah.
I mean, maybe I could take on the buyer side for the is it a reality that public funding can catalyze transformational change by canceling credits for overall mitigation and global emissions? We see some of that, but we also see that the acquiring parties, I mean, the rationale for them to buy ITMOs is that it's cheaper abroad than they can do it at home. So we do have this price challenge that the transformational impact credits are high price, and who will pay for that? And will it? I mean, there are different ways. It's not exactly the same raising ambition through NDC ambition cycles and getting Paris aligned to 1.5 degree pathways. That's sort of the global level, but you can also have transformational change at the activity level, which is more at the sectorial level and national levels, bringing in the new technologies. That yes, they both at that smaller scale can raise ambition of mitigation actions. But but maybe in the global accounting, you can't see it, particularly if it's bought as an offset. Then you don't have for the global accounting a contribution to ambition raising. So is it a reality? Well, we see it in 6.4, it's mandatory 2% overall mitigation of global emissions. In 6.2, it's voluntary. So it's, to my knowledge, it's there, but it's not a lot.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Randall. There's one more question on the mature technologies. So could you clarify again on the low-cost mature technologies, considering the continuous need for large-scale mainstreaming of available technologies? Shouldn't that count to this transformational change?
Yeah, can I take that? Because this comes up a lot, because Carbon Limited does a lot of work in renewable energy. It has, and worked in this a long time. And you're absolutely right. On one hand, we're kind of in this conundrum, because on one hand, in most markets, things like large-scale grid-connected solar PV and wind power are quite competitive. But on the other hand, clearly we don't have as much as we need. So going back to my point, what's the right tool for the job? I think the reason carbon markets is not the right tool for that job is that it's so difficult to weed out the projects that really need the carbon financing versus the ones that don't, that you end up, basically the risk is too high of having a lot of non-additional activities. But therefore, we need to ask, well, what do we then need to do as a global community to make this still happen, right? Maybe it's not actually subsidies for big solar plants. Maybe it is support with tariff reform in those countries. Maybe it is support with grid upgrades and extensions, things that carbon markets don't pay for anyway, but which would actually facilitate many times the amount of investment in renewables, right? And that's kind of what Karin was pointing to about large-scale systemic change. We have to have national and regional grids that can handle this amount of intermittent power and storage, right? That's the key, one of the critical issues, and that's not being funded by carbon markets. So yeah, again, I think with these larger scale and more mature technologies, we have to look at how does the community support that change at a different level other than just a direct subsidy, because it's not a direct subsidy that's needed. It's some other action at the regulatory or policy level to unlock the potential for that rapid growth.
Thank you, Randall. We have time for one more question. In data-poor culture, where even the government departments can sometimes struggle with the authenticity of data, how would you define transition?
I'll leave that one to Karin.
Yeah. Karen, you're on mute if you're saying something.
Yes, I mean, I would define it the same way, even if whether you have data or not. But how can you know then in a data poor country, is this sector being transformed? I think it's can't transform sort of everything at the same time. And when you look at it you can look at it from a scale perspective. And that's why I said before that you can transition can also be a system, you can define the boundaries around a system. You could define it at a city level. So we've seen examples of where, well, we're going to transform the transport system in Bogota or any city. So we're going to make it sustainable. We've also, Philippe, you've had also transport NTC policies where you try to use, you can use also these criteria on transformational change for transforming smaller entities. And for transport, it could be a transition away from cars to more bikes and pedestrians. And you can also, from the sustainable development benefits, you can see that, well, you can have green corridors, you can have health impacts, you can have less air pollution, lots of things that drive sustainable transport. You'll have some mitigation outcomes, but maybe they're hard to measure then you have to count the number of bikes and so on. So in a data poor country, maybe that's difficult, but we have with digital MRV means, and you can bring such new technologies in from carbon markets because it's results-based payments. You really need the MRV part, otherwise you don't have a credit. So I think even in data poor countries, it could be an opportunity for getting more data because you need that for getting sort of data for payments. Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Randall. We still have some unanswered questions in the Q&A, but we don't have the time to take them live. So if you could please use the Q&A function to type the answers or responses to some of that questions. And we also encourage the participants to continue asking these questions, even if they are for Karen and Randall, because they are part of this webinar and they'll help answer any of these questions that you might have on the Q&A. Thank you, Karen and Randall, for taking the time with your presentations and also for answering the questions. It's now time for our next session with our guest speaker for this webinar. We are very happy to have Felipe de Leon from Supervisory Body of the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism with us. I'll pass it on to you now, Felipe, for your presentation.
Hello, can you see me?
Yes, we can see and hear you.
Great. So perhaps I'll start by saying that although I do have very much the pleasure of participating in the supervisory body, as with almost all my interventions, I am speaking on my personal capacity. This is a very interesting subject and a subject that, as Karen has alluded to, the supervisory body is currently engaged in work that relates to it. And I wouldn't want to imply any prejudgment of sort of the decisions that have to be reached there. I was asked to basically provide some feedback to the presentations that we've received and put that into a broader context of work that is currently happening in a few different spaces. As I was alluding to in my question, I think one of the most interesting aspects, or a couple of the most interesting aspects of this guide and of the moment that carbon markets, I think writ large, not only the Article 6 carbon markets, but carbon markets writ large are touched upon in this guidance. One of them, and I'll start there, has to do with this notion that for the next generation of carbon markets, for carbon markets to be successful, to be useful as a tool to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, they have to be funded quite different from carbon markets as we've known them up to now. And this has very technical implications in terms of additionalities and permanences and things like that. But I would argue more interestingly, it has implications along the lines of what Randall was alluding to, implications in terms of what the use case of carbon markets is. Carbon markets are no longer, I think, as Randall pointed out, in their best iteration, are no longer adding to a slow transition as they were in the past. They're very much looking to be transformational, right? To pivot the scale and the speed of change that we need to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that requires a degree of coordination and a degree of synergy with government plans and with sort of the broader ecosystem of decarbonization that's taking place in different countries that wasn't necessarily as relevant when you were under the CDM or under the previous generation, if you will, of carbon markets. And I think that makes the underlying policy regime, if you will, more important in some degrees than it was in the past. Clarity around the plans, clarity around the decarbonization pathways that the country is seeking to achieve, that the host country is seeking to achieve, and clarity about the role that a specific transformation, that a sector, that in some cases a particularly large company or company that controls a large sector can play, is especially important, right? Because it's no longer about just changing from where we are to a better position. It's from changing from where we are to a position that puts us in alignment with a fundamental transformation by middle of the century to basically keep 1.5 alive. And I think it's important to highlight because of the moment in the international cycle that we are. In a lot of countries, as was mentioned in the opening, NDCs are being reevaluated, they're being rewritten, some may be submitted this year, some will be submitted next year. And there's a fundamental opportunity there for countries to take up that challenge and identify what is the role of carbon markets in my NDC. It's not just about saying carbon markets will play a role in mobilizing financing. Okay, fair. That was perhaps a reasonable first step for the first NDC. But now, if a country wants to enable to put itself in the best position possible to engage with Article 6, and again, I would argue with carbon markets writ large, I would suggest that it's not just the level of ambition that is important in the NDC. Absolutely, the level of ambition is critical, right? We have an ambition gap, an ambition gap that is not getting smaller, we've just heard. But it is also the degree of detail about the steps to get to that transition, and as Randall was saying, about what the role of carbon markets is. What are the types of projects and the types of sectors and the types of interventions that carbon markets can support most effectively in your particular trajectory, in your particular policy package. I think NDCs that demonstrate deeper understanding of this will make it easier for other stakeholders to engage. It will make it easier for the private sector to engage. It will make it easier for potential buyers to come up to countries and say, this is something that we want to support. And so having a real understanding of what your decarbonization pathway is, having a real understanding of what role carbon markets play in financing that decarbonization pathway, and that means understanding the pros and cons of carbon markets and what sorts of activities those are most well suited to. And again, I'll highlight what Randall was saying, right? That's not to say that in perhaps other more traditional sectors for carbon markets, and I'm going to use renewable energy just to sort of follow Randall's example. It's not to say that renewable energy is not absolutely critical to the transformations. It's not to say that there are not renewable energy related projects that probably should be supported by carbon markets, but it is perhaps to recognize that finding those might be really hard in most cases, and that makes a difference for how attractive carbon markets might be as a tool to finance renewable energy transitions in a lot of countries versus other sectors. I think this speaks also to the question about data poor countries. Data poor countries, quote unquote, are not data poor in everything, at least not in my experience. Understanding where your data strengths are and what that means for which sectors you might be able to bring into carbon markets quickly and responsibly and robustly, and which data needs you have and how you might be able to fill those so that you can continue to bring up to bring more sectors and more technologies into carbon markets becomes, I think, an important point. So I think that's extremely relevant. The role of buyers as having a responsibility in this, and I think Karen alluded to this, in terms of price and in terms of what sorts of credits they are interested in buying and what sort of price signals we have, I think is extremely relevant. I have a very hard time imagining a $5 ton as actually being robust. I'm sure that there are tons that are robust that were traded at $5, but that doesn't really make it a $5 ton, I would argue. If we want the level of transformational change that we have, that we need, that is going to require a price signal. Quantifying and verifying some of these elements is expensive in itself. And of course, having these impacts, designing projects so that they are not just about the tons, but are about the sustainable development impacts, the transformational change impacts, that has its own costs. It pays off, I think, quite clearly, but they're not available in the vast majority of cases. I'm going to hedge myself here at $5 or $10 or maybe $15 a ton. The price expectation has to match the expectation in terms of impact and social benefits. And the last thing I'll say that I was particularly intrigued and impressed with it from the presentations today, sorry, actually refers to something Malin mentioned, I think, in the introduction. which is this notion that Spark is looking at developing not just guidance, but also tools to support the implementation of some of the, or the implications of the implementation, right? Because some of these things, part of what we're saying here is that this will require a non-trivial level of sophistication in terms of your decarbonization planning, in terms of the understanding of what that implies, in terms of buyers being able to identify where you're going to have a bigger bang for your buck. And so that sophistication has to happen in a relatively small amount of time if this is going to hit, given sort of the timelines that are required to address climate change. And to do that, I've always been of the strong impression that guidance is good, but tools are better. It is not reasonable, efficient, I would argue even possible, for every country to develop on a piecemeal basis the tools that are necessary to address some of the same sorts of problems, right? And so hearing that Spark is looking not just at figuring out the guidance, but in future stages, figuring out what sort of tools can be developed to support the implementation of this at scale, I think is one of those elements that is emerging in a variety of spaces as critical if our carbon markets are going to be successful. There are things that I tend to think of as pretty much shared infrastructure. And if that shared infrastructure is not there, it is going to be very hard for carbon markets to be successful because the needs are not cannot be met at an individual level. They are systemic needs. This refers to quantification and data needs, but it refers also to practices and infrastructure around, for example, stakeholder consultation, ensuring that FPIC is actually respected where it applies. All of these things have been troubling carbon markets and similar instruments for years and for decades in some cases. I would argue that part of the reason is that they are systemic needs that require systemic solutions, and this shift towards tools and towards recognizing systemic issues as requiring systemic solutions, I think is quite important. And I'm very glad to see those first steps being taken in the framing, I guess, of Spark. I saw some questions coming up in the chat, so I'll stop there and leave time for those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. We are also eager to take questions from our participants on what you just spoke about. But before that, just a note for our participants, the presentations so far were very concise and cover the guide at a very high level. We have sent a link in the chat where you can download this guide and also other guides that are part of this toolbox. So please feel free to use that link to look through the entire guide, which has more detailed information on this. And again, please use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you might have. So Felipe, if I may, could you reflect a bit on how Costa Rica is addressing these issues?
So I'm not in Costa Rica. I haven't been working with Costa Rica for a few years. I'm currently living in the United States. I can refer to how we thought about it when I was there, which I think is part of I mean, perhaps shed some light on your question. And it's interesting because the guidance that Karen referred to, the ICANN guidance on transformational change that Karen referred to, if I'm not mistaken, was piloted with Costa Rica and sort of the team that I used to work with a few years back. And I think there's a third element there that is interesting and that we discussed back then, which maybe I'll bring to the table. Karen mentioned the scale and permanence of the emission reductions and the scale and permanence of the SDG impacts. And perhaps before I get into what I was going to say, I'll make a small side road. The importance of having a clear framework for SDG assessment, SDG impact assessment, both in terms of negative and positive impacts, I think is hard to overemphasize. There's this tension, I think, there's this natural inclination to want to use SDGs or these sorts of sustainable development impact frameworks to quantify positives, and there's this reluctance in a lot of spaces, I think, to want to look at the negative impacts, because there is this notion that if it had negative impacts, it should have been caught in the safeguards, or there should be a mitigation plan, or all of these things, right? I would argue that it's important for countries and for developers actually to be looking at the tensions and the inherent trade-offs in their projects, right? A project that increases conservation areas may reduce job availability in some areas. That's not to say that that project shouldn't happen. It is to say that it is important to recognize those, to manage them where available, but to accept that they don't go away, right? That there is trade-offs inherent in sort of these processes, and ignoring them actually reduces social license for these projects because it marginalizes, it ostracizes communities or groups. Actually looking at them, engaging with them, and bringing those into the conversation is then not just about doing what is right and morally appropriate, but it's about hedging risks. It's about ensuring the survivability of projects and the sustainability of projects and approaches over the long term, because you have long-term social license, because you have actually looked at the impacts beyond just the tons of those projects. So wanted to highlight that. And so that's been a big part of how Costa Rica has tried to look at if you look at Costa Rica's last NDC, which I had the privilege of working on, it is very specifically framed from a human rights and from a social and justice transformation standpoint. And it recognizes that if we are going to reinvent the entire country and the economy, it might as well, it had better not just be for the tons, it had better deliver a more just, more equitable Costa Rica. And that is, I would argue, in that particular case, it started a lot from a moral standpoint and sort of from a history of the country standpoint. But I think it was very quickly recognized as one of the core strategies to provide sustainability, and in this sense, not like environmental sustainability, but project sustainability to these sorts of interventions and to these efforts. It won't guarantee any specific project makes it, but if the vision is aligned with building a better reality for the vast majority of Costa Ricans, it is far more likely to survive as a vision and to then evolve. And evolve, it will have to anyway. So that was, I think, one of the what I would argue is one of the big insights of what we were trying to do with that approach.
Thanks a lot, Felipe. I know it's quite hard to summarize that in such a short time span and in short number of words, but thanks a lot for the insights on that. Given the time zone and for this afternoon session, and since Colombia is one of the SPAR countries, we seem to have a lot of Colombians here, and they are looking at the biodiversity COP coming up, and someone's asking what your opinion is on the state of biodiversity credits and how this could move into a more relevant market. So in a sense, is there a link between the biodiversity agenda and the Article 6 in the context of transformational change and ambition?
Oof, that is definitely a thorny issue. My first answer would be yes, there's definitely a link there, right? I mean, the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis are inextricably linked, and how we address them, I think, matters. I'm only barely familiar with biodiversity credits, only in passing familiar with biodiversity credits. But what I would say is that there are definitely lessons to be learned, at the very least, from both what has gone right and what has gone wrong with carbon credits. If there's interest in moving into the biodiversity space, right? And I would say a lot of the issues around data, a lot of the issues around ensuring fungibility and like, we have difficulties agreeing whether we should be using which conversion factor we should be using to convert methane to tons of CO2 equivalent. And that's been raging forever, and it makes a huge difference in some cases, right? That is a trivially simple conversion compared to the sorts of conversions that have to happen to make biodiversity credits fungible. So recognizing that that's going to require either some huge advances, as far as I understand them, in our capacity to measure and to analyze things, particularly because there are overlaps, right? Where you have huge biodiversity is often where you don't have a lot of people and a lot of infrastructure, and therefore where you don't necessarily have a lot of data. That's not true in all cases. There are some amazing things happening. Yeah, there are some amazing things happening in remote sensing and things like that. But you either have clarity on what that means, or you're building a system and a framework that is designed to work recognizing those limitations and then has a slightly different angle. I don't know what that would look like, but I think, and this is one of those, I think this applies to pretty much everything that happens in these market-based mechanisms. the solution is never, I would argue, to reduce rigor. The solution is to find ways to make rigor accessible to everybody, right? It's how you make sure that the countries that don't have data get access to that data or don't need that data to get to the level of rigor. It is not by reducing rigor that you're going to fix this, because by reducing rigor, you are fundamentally breaking the system rather than making the system useful to those who need it.
Thanks a lot, Felipe. That was most definitely not an easy question to answer, but I think you've tackled that well. Just a note for our participants, you will now see another poll on the screen with survey questions for feedback on the webinar. It helps us improve our content for the future webinars as well. So please do answer that survey. And thanks a lot, Felipe, for the presentation and taking the time to answer the questions from our participants. I would also like to thank Karen and Randall for their presentations. Another kind reminder to our participants to please answer the survey, follow the SPARC websites for more updates on the guides, and also access these guides. I think it's a very good guide for all of the information on Article 6 that you need to have. So we hope to see you in our future webinars and have a nice day. But before we leave, I have a note for the speakers. If you could please switch on your video for a group photo, that would be great.
Okay, I'm going to take the photo here in just a second, so everyone smiles, please. Okay. Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Take care, bye.